has seen historic success in the Everglades.
As Fox 35's Carla Byron explains, it's helping to remove Burmese pythons from the wild in record numbers.
Picture this. A government agency stands before cameras and announces it is releasing thousands of living creatures into one of America's most fragile ecosystems. Not traps. Not chemicals. Not drones. Creatures. The room goes quiet for a second, and then the laughter starts. Social media erupts. Talk show hosts make it a punchline for weeks. Florida, a state already famous for bizarre headlines, has apparently done it again. But here is the part nobody expected. It worked. And the story of how it worked is one of the most remarkable ecological turnarounds of the 21st century. To understand why Florida made a decision that looked insane to the rest of the world, you have to understand what the Everglades had become. This vast wetland, stretching across roughly 1.5 million acres of southern Florida, was once one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. Wading birds gathered in the thousands. Alligators ruled the waterways. White-tailed deer moved through the sawgrass in the early mornings. Marsh rabbits darted through the underbrush. The whole system hummed with a kind of wild energy that scientists and tourists traveled great distances just to witness. It was irreplaceable, and Florida knew it. What Florida did not fully appreciate, not until it was almost too late, was how quickly that irreplaceable world could come apart. The unraveling began quietly in the late 1980s and accelerated through the 1990s. Burmese pythons, native to Southeast Asia, began showing up in the Everglades. Some escaped from breeding facilities during Hurricane Andrew in 1992. Others were released by pet owners who had bought them as small, manageable animals and then panicked when those animals grew to the length of a small car. At first, wildlife managers treated the sightings as isolated incidents. A python here, a python there. Nothing to panic about. That casual attitude turned out to be one of the most expensive mistakes in American conservation history. By the 2000s, the python population had exploded into something almost incomprehensible. Estimates today range from 100,000 to as many as 300,000 snakes living in the wild across South Florida. These are not shy, reclusive animals. Burmese pythons are apex predators. Adults routinely exceed 15 feet. The largest ever caught in Florida measured just over 18 feet and weighed more than 100 pounds. They are ambush hunters of extraordinary patience and efficiency, capable of swallowing a white-tailed deer whole. In a landscape with no natural predators to keep them in check, they simply ate everything. Raccoon populations in heavily infested areas crashed by over 99%. Opossum numbers fell by nearly 98%. Bobcat sightings dropped by close to 88%. Marsh rabbits, once ubiquitous, became genuinely difficult to find. The Everglades, the river of grass, was falling silent in the most literal way imaginable. Florida tried everything conventional wildlife management had to offer. The state organized hunting competitions, drawing hundreds of participants from across the country. In 2024, nearly 860 hunters took part in the annual Python Challenge, and they removed 195 snakes. That sounds significant until you consider what it represents against a population of potentially 300,000. Professional removal contractors, paid year-round by the South Florida Water Management District, worked tirelessly. Thermal drones swept the wetlands at night. Trained detection dogs sniffed out hiding snakes. Biologists even experimented with fitting male pythons with radio transmitters and releasing them to lead researchers to breeding aggregations. Everything helped a little. Nothing helped enough. Scientists began saying out loud what many had quietly feared. Full eradication of the Burmese python from the Everglades is almost certainly impossible. The question was no longer how to eliminate the invader. The question became how to restore enough balance that the ecosystem could survive alongside it. That shift in thinking is what led to the decision that made the world laugh. The eastern indigo snake, Drymarchon cooperi, is the longest native snake species in the United States. Adults regularly reach 7 to 8 feet, and exceptional individuals push 9 feet. Despite that size, this animal is non-venomous and, remarkably, quite docile around humans. Early naturalists who encountered them described them as almost regal in their bearing, and the nickname that followed them through the centuries captures that quality precisely: the Emperor of the Forest. The indigo snake once ranged across the entire southeastern United States, from the Carolinas to Texas, thriving in longleaf pine forests, scrublands, and the sandy ridges that characterized so much of the pre-development South. It ate almost anything it could catch: rodents, birds, frogs, lizards, turtle eggs, and other snakes. Its resistance to venom meant rattlesnakes and cottonmouths were not threats but prey. It was the keystone predator of an entire biome, and like so many keystone species, almost nobody noticed it until it was nearly gone. The collapse of the eastern indigo snake was slow and grinding. The longleaf pine ecosystem that once covered close to 90 million acres across the South had been reduced to roughly 3% of that original range by the late 20th century. Logging, agriculture, and urban development ate through the habitat decade by decade. The snake's dependence on gopher-tortoise burrows for shelter, nesting, and thermoregulation made it doubly vulnerable, because gopher tortoises were also declining rapidly under the pressure of habitat loss and poaching. By 1978, the eastern indigo snake was listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. Isolated populations clung to survival in pockets of Florida and southern Georgia, but the emperor's kingdom had been reduced to fragments. Conservation biologists refused to give up on this animal. Starting in the 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s and 2010s, programs at institutions including the Orianne Society, the Central Florida Zoo, and the Joseph W. Jones Ecological Research Center began breeding eastern indigo snakes in captivity with serious intent to return them to the wild. The work was painstaking. Captive breeding of large, long-lived reptiles requires extraordinary patience. Habitat restoration had to run parallel to the snake breeding program, because releasing snakes into degraded land accomplishes nothing. Conservationists work to restore longleaf pine stands, reintroduce controlled burns to maintain the open understory these ecosystems require, and protect gopher-tortoise populations so the burrows would be available when the snakes arrived. It took years to build the foundation. The public, understandably, was not paying attention. When Florida wildlife officials began announcing large-scale reintroductions of eastern indigo snakes, framing them in part as a response to the python crisis, the reaction was swift and merciless. The jokes wrote themselves. Florida, already burdened with a reputation for improbable wildlife encounters, was adding more snakes to a state already overrun with snakes. Commenters on social media suggested this was the same logic as fighting a house fire with a slightly different kind of fire. Others invoked the 1883 introduction of mongooses to Hawaii, where an attempt to control rats in sugarcane fields produced a predator that went on to devastate native ground-nesting bird populations instead. The mongoose comparison was not entirely unfair. History is genuinely full of biological control efforts that created new catastrophes. The skepticism was not irrational. What the skeptics missed was how different this situation was from those historical blunders. The eastern indigo snake is not an introduced species. It is not foreign to Florida's ecosystems. It evolved in these landscapes over millions of years. Its prey relationships, its habitat preferences, its seasonal behaviors, all of it is calibrated to this specific environment. Reintroducing it is not adding something new to the system. It is restoring something the system already knew how to use. This distinction matters enormously in ecology. Biological control using non-native species carries unpredictable risks because those species carry no evolutionary history with the local food web. Restoration of native apex predators is a fundamentally different proposition, one with a growing record of success in ecosystems around the world. The results in Florida began coming in slowly, as ecological recovery always does. In autumn 2023, trail cameras at the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve in the Florida Panhandle captured images that stopped researchers in their tracks. Two wild-born eastern indigo snake hatchlings appeared on film. One of them carried no tag, meaning it had been born entirely outside of human assistance, the offspring of previously released individuals that had found each other, mated, nested, and successfully raised young in the wild. This was the first confirmed wild reproduction of eastern indigo snakes in North Florida in nearly 50 years. The program was not just sustaining itself. It was regenerating. By 2024 and into 2025, monitoring teams were documenting more than a dozen individual snakes across multiple counties in northern Florida, including a large 6-foot male moving confidently through restored scrub habitat and a female originally released in 2019 still active and apparently thriving 6 years later. In Alabama, parallel reintroduction efforts released 44 snakes in 2025, adding to a growing total of more than 500 eastern indigos returned to their native range across the region. Other states began watching the Florida and Alabama results closely. The blueprint was being written in real time. As for the pythons themselves, the eastern indigo snake is not a silver bullet. No honest biologist claims that even thousands of indigos will erase a python population numbering potentially in the hundreds of thousands. What the indigos can do is apply meaningful pressure on juvenile pythons, the stage of life when the invasive snakes are most vulnerable, while simultaneously signaling to the broader ecosystem that the predator hierarchy is being rebuilt. There is also documented evidence that native predators in the Everglades are beginning to adapt in ways that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. In 2022, a trail camera recorded a Florida bobcat killing and partially consuming an adult Burmese python weighing more than twice the bobcat's own body weight, a behavior with no prior documentation in Florida wildlife records. Alligators have been observed taking juvenile and subadult pythons with increasing frequency. Even Florida panthers have been photographed engaging pythons. These are not solutions. They are signs that the system is finding its footing again, that the ecological memory stored in Florida's native predators is slowly being activated by new pressures and new opportunities. What Florida understood, after years of failed frontal assaults on the python problem, was that ecological crises cannot be solved by subtraction alone. Removing the thing causing harm is necessary but not sufficient. The system that allowed the harm to take hold in the first place has to be rebuilt. That means restoring the predators, the prey, the habitat, and the relationships that held everything in balance before the disruption arrived. It is slower than a hunt. It is less dramatic than a drone strike. It does not generate the same kind of headlines. But it is what actually works. The laughter has faded. In its place, quietly, something more interesting has arrived: evidence. Hatchling indigo snakes photographed in the wild for the first time in half a century. An ecosystem showing small but measurable signs of recalibration. A conservation program built over decades of disciplined, unglamorous work beginning to pay forward. Florida made a bet that nature, if given back enough of what it needs, will do what humans never fully could. The joke, it turns out, was always on the people laughing.